Hello and welcome to our podcast on Persepolis and a little bit of Iranian history here. More of a background knowledge podcast to kind of help you figure out and to place where the graphic novel of Persepolis fits in terms of world history. So let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So the title of the graphic novel Persepolis comes from the capital of the ancient Persian Empire. And so here is a map of the Middle East, and you can see where the Persian Empire was at its height in 475 BCE, or before the Common Era. And so we don't have the lines on the political map like we would today, but you can see approximately in the yellow parallelogram where the modern state of Iran is today. So it becomes eventually carved out of what was once the great Persian Empire. And towards the south there, almost on the Arabian Sea, you can see the city of Persepolis. But you can see where the Persian Empire was at its height, on the east all the way into what is now India, past the Indus Valley, and then all the way to the west past Turkey and into what is now Greece and North Africa. So at its height, the Persian Empire was very large. And so as the Persian Empire changed and started to decline, it was taken over by Alexander the Great's empire from 336 to 323 BCE. And again, you can see the extent of Alexander the Great's empire, reaching pretty far to the east and starting pretty far to the west there as well. And again, the yellow parallelogram showing us where today's nation of Iran fits into these larger ancient empires. And as we go through this and we're talking about the different types of governmental structures that took turns ruling over what becomes Iran, really go back to your governmental class and be thinking about that political spectrum. So again, here's just that spectrum: left wing, right wing, liberal, conservative. The idea of something to the left being more liberal, radical, revolutionary, but also things moving to the right being radical and reactionary. So as you hear these different types of governmental structures in play, overlay the political spectrum that you learned whenever you took that last government class, and consider how the country of Iran moved back and forth along the political spectrum depending on who was in charge at the time. And so as we get into the book of Persepolis, we want to frame where and when we're talking about. So we're going to jump forward in history dramatically here from the ancient Persian Empire and the time of Alexander the Great to, in essence, the end of World War II and pretty much the modern day. So this book takes place around the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And the book is autobiographical, where the author, Marjane Satrapi, wrote it about herself. Now, of course, there are fictional elements to this. There are embellishments, there are changes in order to keep it somewhat fictional, but it is strongly autobiographical. And she said she wrote this to give the world another view of Iranians and of the country of Iran, because having grown up there, she saw how the nation was perceived by the rest of the world. And so she wanted to sort out some of the stereotypes and some of the misconceptions that people tended to have about the country she loved. So from ancient times, fast forward to 1925. So we are post-World War I. We are about to hit the Great World Depression, and Iran is being ruled by a man named Reza Shah Pahlavi. And so he rules from 1925 to 1941. And he ruled in a very authoritarian governmental style. Strict censorship of what people were able to do, read, experience, heavy use of propaganda to make his government seem like the best in the world. As World War II was getting more and more intense, around 1941, he was forced to give up the throne, and he was replaced by his son. So Reza Shah was pushed out of the leadership role because the English and the Soviets invaded. And so Reza Shah was pushed out by that invasion because the English and Soviets, who were allies during World War II, were nervous about maintaining supply lines, since Iran has a large stockpile of oil within it, and also it helps connect the Arabian Sea to some of the Soviet oil fields. They were very nervous about having a Nazi sympathizer in charge of Iran. So he was pushed out. And then, like we said, he was replaced by his son, who then ruled from 1941 to 1979. And so Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was known as simply the Shah, which is synonymous with the king. And so he moves power away from himself a little bit and more towards power of parliament. So kind of like a monarchy, because power was passed from father to son, but also some power in this consulting body of parliament, similar to what the United Kingdom has, similar to what the United States has in terms of Congress. So he was also empowered during what was called the White Revolution, which was a time of economic, social, political reforms, trying to move Iran to be more of a global power, not just a regional area. So working on modernizing the nation, granting women's suffrage, which is the right to vote, and nationalizing some industries. And specifically, the one that got everyone's attention was the idea of nationalizing the oil industry. So during World War II, basically Iran's oil was being controlled by the British. And Iranians under Mohammad Reza Shah were like, wait a second, that's our oil. Shouldn't we as Iranians control our own oil? And so, under his rule, they nationalized the oil industry and pushed away the British control of that resource. So once the Iranians are nationalizing their industry of oil, some people are looking at it as Iranians being communist. Because you have to remember, this is right during that Cold War time, where you have the capitalist society of the United States ideologically battling the communist society of the Soviet Union after World War II. And so in the United States, everything becomes very black and white, very capitalism good, communism bad. So when Iran nationalizes the oil industry, which they were doing so they could earn the profits themselves rather than the British digging up their oil and the British benefiting, people around the world saw that and said, wait a second, Iran seems to be kind of communist. And at the time, during the Cold War, people didn't like communism, and so Iran becomes seen as this very negative place in the world. Now, like we said, Iran had a monarchy and the Pahlavi family, but it also had a parliament. And so the leader of parliament is called the prime minister. And so the guy who actually undertakes nationalizing the oil industry is a guy by the name of Mohammad Mossadeq. And so he is prime minister from 1951 to 1953, so the height of the Cold War. And so the United States sees him and Pahlavi nationalizing the oil industry. They label them as communists and are saying, wait a second, we don't want more communists in the world. It's bad enough to have the Soviet Union being communist. And by this time, China has also become communist from 1949. So the United States says, hey, we can't have this large stockpile of oil being controlled by nationalized oil industry or potential communists in Iran. And so, while Mossadegh was doing this to help the Iranian people get profits for their own product, the United States saw them as communist. The United States, with the help of the Central Intelligence Agency, so our spy network, basically starts a coup. And so a guy by the name of Kermit Roosevelt, he was like the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, goes to Iran and pushes and starts a coup. And so the people of Iran are in essence tricked to turning against other people from Iran. The people rise up and they want Mossadegh out. The CIA in the United States, we get our way. Mossadegh is removed. He is put on trial for being a traitor. And the Shah is put back in power without this liberal influence of Mossadegh saying, hey, we need to have more nationalized control over the oil. And so the United States felt that the Shah could be more controlled by the United States, and the United States gets their way and better access to Iranian oil. And so as we had said, as the Shah returns, he has this push to kind of westernize Iran, and so that is moving in a more liberal direction, and not liberal as in like far left on our political spectrum here in the United States. Nobody would have confused the Shah for being a Democrat or a farther left socialist. He did maintain control by using the Savak, which was a secret police. And so basically going around pulling up political prisoners, anybody who spoke out about the Shah was disappeared. They just did not exist in society anymore. So while he was a little bit more liberal than his father, Iran remained this monarchy with a side of parliament, still very conservative by America's standards today. And so what ended the Shah's rule in 1979 was the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And so this is where the graphic novel of Persepolis is set. This is where our main character of Marjane is growing up in. She is a young child at the time of the Islamic Revolution. And so in essence, a guy by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini comes to power, and he's called the Ayatollah, which again is like a king, like a religious leader who is in charge of everything. And he comes to power with this Islamic Revolution and pushes the country more towards an Islamic state, instituting Sharia law, which is taking the Quran and its teachings literally. This idea of fundamentalist Muslim rule. So Iran is not being led by this monarchy family with a side of parliament. It is now being led by this religious theocracy where they take the Quran literally. And so during the time of the book Persepolis, Iran becomes a theocracy, which is that system of government in which officials rule in the name of their God or divine guidance. Their guiding governmental documents are not something like a constitution or collections of documents set on government. Their guiding political document becomes their religious book. And so we have fundamentalist Muslims taking over Iran in 1979. And so please don't think that fundamentalism is only reserved for the Islamic faith. There are fundamentalists in all world faiths. So Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, etc. There are always people who are in a religion and who are going to take it more in a more strict fashion where they take their holy books literally, not interpreting them to say, well, did Moses really part the Red Sea? They would believe that that really absolutely happened. And so what will you see happen in the book? What did we see happen in society? We see very traditional garb that people are wearing. Men are to wear full beards and not cut them. They're wearing their shirts long and untucked, basically covering the awra, which is part of the body from navel to knee, which was considered a very sacred part of the body, so that was to be covered. Women are now wearing the veil in Iran, whereas before you will see pictures of Iranian women looking very much like people in Western Europe. Nothing on their head, wearing Western-style clothes, but with this 79 Islamic Revolution moving towards theocracy, women are forced to wear more conservative garb and cover themselves. You can see various forms of Islamic head coverings for women. The Muslim faith calls on women to cover themselves when they have reached puberty. And so various countries would interpret exactly what constitutes effective and appropriate head covering. So you might have the more simple hijab that kind of covers the head around the neck, or you might have the more completely covering burqa, where there are no body parts of women being shown in public. But again, this shows a move on the political spectrum of Iran and Iranian society from a somewhat liberal monarchy with a parliament under the Shah to a much more conservative view under the Ayatollah. And as that Islamic Revolution is happening, there was an American embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran. And so some Islamic students hold 52 Americans hostage for over a year. They basically say the people in this embassy are a symbol of the things that Iran no longer likes, the liberal West. And so these more conservative theological Iranian students hold these hostages for over a year. And this is where we start to hear in the lexicon where Iran is calling the United States the Great Satan. There was a movie that came out a couple years ago called Argo, and this was detailing the story about how some hostages were snuck out of Iran with the help of some Canadians. Then, because the world is complicated, right as this Islamic Revolution is happening, a neighboring country of Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, saw that their neighboring country of Iran was in a mess, and they saw an opportunity to take back some land from Iran that had been taken in some older conquests and exchanges. And of course, there was oil within this land. So for about 8 years, Iraq invaded invaded Iran, and it was like a World War I stalemate. Like there was barbed wire, there was trenches dug, a lot of people died. Eventually, chemical weapons were used by Iraq on Iran, killing a lot of people. And then this is where it gets super complicated. The United States was upset that Iran had taken hostages. The United States was upset that Iran had, in essence, kicked out the British, who were an ally. So the United States sides with Iraq, giving them weapons and money. And so if you're thinking ahead, you're like, wait a second. So in the mid-80s, we are supporting Saddam Hussein as a sort of ally. Yet in the 1990s, we fight the first Gulf War against Saddam Hussein? Yes. And then in 2003, we fight the second Gulf War against Saddam Hussein, find him, and he is then executed? Yes. So the United States at this time was siding with Saddam Hussein and Iraq because they were disrupting and fighting against the current enemy at the time, which was Iran. But just when you thought it couldn't get any more confusing, from 1985 to 1987, we get what's called the Iran-Contra affair. And so remember, we are in the midst of the Cold War, where the United States has sworn itself to stop communism no matter where it shows up. So, in the country of Nicaragua, in Central America, so relatively close to the United States, a communist threat comes up. The Sandinistas were threatening in Nicaragua in terms of taking over the government. And the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, looks at that and is like, wait a second, that's way too close for communism. We gotta stop these Sandinistas. And so there was a group who was fighting against them called the Contras, right? Because in Spanish, against means contra. And so Reagan wanted to help the Contras because they were fighting communism. So what does he do? He starts secretly selling weapons to Iran, right? We had just been helping Iraq 3 years before this. But now, since there's communists nearby, we start selling weapons to Iran to raise money. They're giving that money to the Contras. Now, Congress discovers all this and tells him to stop, saying, President Reagan, you can't do this. Now, Reagan doesn't stop this. It just keeps going. And so the historical question is, should he have been impeached? Should he have been accused of a crime? Because Congress told him directly, you cannot be selling weapons to Iran to help this group in Nicaragua. He was not impeached, many people say, because he was so grandfatherly, and he just seemed so nice, and we just couldn't do that to the old man. Anyway, at the end of this, somebody had to go down for the Iran-Contra affair. And so got a Marine by the name of Oliver North gets blamed for the whole thing. But from 1989 to the present, we do see some reform efforts in this Islamic Revolution, where we do have these pushes and pulls about moving Iran to a more liberal seeming nation versus the Islamic clerics who want to keep Iran more conservative. And so in 2005, a guy by the name of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is elected. He is anti-Shah, so kind of historical. He is anti-Israel, and he is seeking to build up the nuclear capabilities of Iran so they could become a nuclear power in the world. So he is in charge of like the secular government, like the government that's not religious. At the same time, you have Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme leader in terms of the religious side. And then after Ahmadinejad, a guy by the name of Rouhani becomes president. And again, we have this pushing, pulling of where is Iran going to fit? Is it going to stay hard right as a Muslim theocracy? Is it going to move a little bit more to the left toward a democracy, perhaps? And then the most recent information we have about Iran in the current world is the Iran nuclear deal that lasted from 2015 to 2018. Basically, as Iran was trying to move toward the left a little bit and move towards more democratic thinking nations and trying to increase trade, a deal was struck between Iran, the US, the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, and Germany. And basically, what happened was Iran said, okay, we will stop trying to make nuclear weapons. You can send inspectors, keep an eye on us, make sure we're not cheating. We will also reduce our stockpile until 2031, limit research until 2024 about making a nuclear weapon. In exchange, can you please, UK, France, China, Russia, all these other developed nations, can you lift these economic sanctions? where basically Iran had not been allowed to sell their oil to much of the world, and they had not been able to use international banks for any of the money that they did get. So with the Iran nuclear deal, Iran pledges to not keep moving forward on a nuclear weapon in exchange for the ability to join the developed world, remove some of the sanctions, allow them to sell their oil to more of the world. In 2018, President Trump decided to abandon that deal and reinstated sanctions because he felt Iran was not holding up their end of the deal, although United Nations inspectors had said that Iran was holding up their side of the deal. Regardless, that deal is in effect over when the United States backs out because the other nations kind of just fall apart. So now currently, Iran has massive sanctions put on it. Its society is economically struggling, and they may or may not be resuming their look at nuclear weapons because they're under no obligation to not. So that is it. A lot of setup for a graphic novel about a girl growing up in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, but we wanted to give you a little bit of history, maybe too much history, give you some context for where this story takes place, because this part of the world, definitely specifically the country of Iran, might be relatively unknown to many of us. But as we read this, we are focusing partially on the history, but also just on the human story. That's what matters here. A child growing up in difficult circumstances, with a family history, with friends who struggle also. So we wanted to frame the context of Persepolis for us as we get started. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, please bring those in. Otherwise, we will see you soon.